They say power is everything in the underworld. Money, fear, respect. Jinwoo Park had all three. What he didn't have was the one thing that made him feel like a man. For 3 years, his body had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. 3 years of avoiding women, of making excuses, of feeling the weight of shame pressed down on him every time he saw the knowing looks from his subordinates. 3 years of wondering if the bullet that grazed his spine had taken more than just his blood. He ruled the Korean Mafia's operations in Los Angeles with an iron fist, but in the bedroom, he was powerless. The doctors had no answers. The pills didn't work. The shame became a second skin, invisible to everyone but suffocating to him alone. He started to believe this was his punishment, his curse, the price for all the blood on his hands. Then she walked into his club on a Tuesday night. Naomi Williams. A black woman who moved like she owned every room she entered, who looked at him without fear or calculation, who somehow saw past the expensive suit and the dangerous reputation to the broken man underneath. She didn't know about his condition. She didn't know that every conversation they had, every moment of tension between them, was torture of a different kind. She didn't know that for the first time in 3 years, his body responded to someone, wanted someone, betrayed him by working exactly when it shouldn't, exactly when he couldn't risk exposing his secret. And she definitely didn't know that wanting her would put her in the crosshairs of every enemy he'd ever made. This is a story about a man who lost himself and a woman who refused to let him stay lost. About desire that goes deeper than the body. About the kind of love that doesn't fix you, but makes you want to fix yourself. And about how sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a world built on violence is let someone see you as you really are. Jinwoo Park was not a man who showed weakness. In the 3 years since the incident, he had perfected the art of deflection, the careful dance of maintaining appearances while his insides twisted with shame. He sat now in his private office above the Lotus Club, his flagship establishment on Western Avenue, watching the security feeds with the kind of focus that made younger men nervous. The club was doing well. Better than well. Money flowed through this place like water, most of it clean enough to pass inspection, some of it still carrying the stink of the streets. His phone buzzed. A text from Min SEO, his second-in-command. The shipment was delayed. Problems at the port. Jinwoo's jaw tightened, but his face remained impassive. Problems meant someone was either incompetent or disloyal, and he had no patience for either. He typed back a curt response and set the phone down, his eyes returning to the monitors. That's when he saw her. She was standing at the bar, talking to James, the head bartender. Jinwoo leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued not by attraction. He'd trained himself not to feel that anymore, to shut it down before it could humiliate him, but by the way she carried herself. She was tall, maybe 5'9", with dark skin that caught the club's purple lighting like polished mahogany. Her hair was natural, cut close on the sides and full on top, and she wore a black dress that was elegant without trying too hard. But it wasn't her appearance that held his attention. It was the way she surveyed the room, the subtle scan of exits and faces, the way her posture remained relaxed while her eyes stayed alert. She was either law enforcement or she understood how to move in dangerous spaces. Jinwoo pressed the intercom button. James. The bartender touched his earpiece, listening. On the monitor, Jinwoo watched him nod slightly before turning back to the woman. A brief exchange, then James pointed toward the back hallway, toward the private elevator that led to Jinwoo's office. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on his door. Come in. She entered with the same confidence she'd shown downstairs, but up close, Jinwoo could see the intelligence in her eyes, the way she took in every detail of his office, the minimalist furniture, the abstract art that cost more than most people's cars, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Koreatown. She extended her hand. Mr. Park. Naomi Williams. Thank you for seeing me. Her handshake was firm. Jinwoo gestured to the chair across from his desk. Ms. Williams. James said you were asking questions about employment opportunities. It was a polite fiction. She hadn't been asking about a job. She'd been asking about him. Naomi settled into the chair with an ease that surprised him. Most people, especially people who knew who he really was, carried tension in his presence. She didn't. I'll be direct, Mr. Park. I'm not looking for employment. I'm looking for information. Information about what? About who killed my brother. Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but internally, he recalibrated. This wasn't law enforcement. This was something more dangerous. This was personal. I'm sorry for your loss, Ms. Williams, but I'm not sure why you think I would have information about your brother. Marcus Williams. He was shot 3 months ago outside a warehouse in Vernon. The police think it was gang-related, but the detective assigned to his case is either incompetent or paid to be incompetent. I've spent the last 12 weeks following threads, and several of them lead back to operations in this area. Operations that you oversee. She said it without accusation, just flat statement of fact. Jinwoo leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Possibly both. The police are better equipped to investigate murders than I am. The police told me my brother was a drug dealer. He wasn't. Marcus was a medical student at USC. He was brilliant and kind, and he had no business being in Vernon at all, let alone near a warehouse district at midnight. People end up in unexpected places for unexpected reasons. Not Marcus. Her voice had steel in it now. Someone set him up. Someone used him. And then someone killed him to cover it up. Jinwoo was silent for a long moment. He didn't owe this woman anything, and getting involved in whatever her brother had stumbled into was a complication he didn't need. But there was something about her, about the way grief sat on her shoulders without bending them, that kept him from dismissing her outright. Even if what you say is true, he said carefully, why would I help you? Because you have resources I don't. Because you know people I can't reach. And because I'm not leaving Los Angeles until I find out what happened to him. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking you to avenge him or get involved directly. I'm asking you to point me in the right direction. After that, I handle it myself. And if the direction I point you gets you killed, then at least I'll die knowing the truth. Jinwoo almost smiled. Almost. You're very confident in your ability to survive in a world you clearly don't understand. I understand it better than you think. She met his eyes without flinching. I grew up in Compton, Mr. Park. I know what violence looks like. I know what poverty does to people. My mother cleaned houses so Marcus and I could go to good schools. She died when I was 16, and I made sure Marcus finished high school and got into college. I've been fighting my whole life. This is just another fight. There was no self-pity in her words, just fact. Jinwoo found himself reassessing her again. She wasn't naive. She was desperate, but she was smart about it. What did your brother study? Molecular biology. He wanted to be a researcher, find treatments for diseases that kill people in our community at higher rates than others. Her voice softened slightly. He was good. Really good. He had a full scholarship and a spot in a lab. He was supposed to graduate next year. Jinwoo thought about the warehouse in Vernon. He knew the area. Some of his operations touched it, though nothing directly under his control. If someone was running something unauthorized, using his territory without permission, that was a problem regardless of whether this woman's brother had been involved. I'll ask some questions, he said finally. If I find anything relevant, I'll let you know. Naomi's shoulders relaxed slightly, the first sign of relief he'd seen from her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If your brother was involved in something, even accidentally, you might not like what I find. I can handle the truth. We'll see. Jinwoo stood, a clear signal the meeting was over. Naomi rose as well. He walked her to the door, very aware of how tall she was, how she didn't have to look up much to meet his eyes. He was 6'1", and in heels, she nearly matched his height. How do I contact you? She pulled out a business card. Naomi Williams, RN, BSN. A hospital in Inglewood. I work nights mostly, but I keep my phone on. A nurse. That explained the steady hands, the calm in crisis. Jinwoo took the card, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact was nothing professional, meaningless. Except his body, his treacherous, broken body, responded to that half-second of touch with a jolt of awareness he hadn't felt in 3 years. Heat spread through him, sudden and shocking. He pulled his hand back quickly, careful to keep his face neutral even as his heart rate kicked up. No, not now. Not with her. Not after 3 years of nothing. Naomi didn't seem to notice his momentary tension. She nodded once, professional, and left. Jinwoo closed the door behind her and stood there for a moment, his hand still holding her card, his body still humming with that unexpected spark of response. For 3 years, nothing. No pills, no therapy, no woman, no matter how beautiful, had managed to provoke even a flicker of physical desire. His body had been as dead as the men he'd ordered buried. The doctors had called it psychological, said the injury to his spine shouldn't have caused this, that it was in his head. Jinwoo had stopped seeing doctors after the first year. He'd accepted it as his new reality, this permanent half-life where he could kill and command but not touch, not want, not feel. And now, from one accidental brush of skin, everything was awake again. He crossed his desk and sat down heavily, tossing the card onto the polished surface. This was dangerous. Not the investigation into her brother, he could handle that easily. This sudden return of sensation, this was the danger. Because if his body worked with her, if she was somehow the key, then he had a choice to make. He could pursue it, risk the humiliation of her discovering his past failure, risk the vulnerability of needing someone. Or he could shut it down, send her away, go back to the safe numbness he'd built around himself. Jinwoo picked up his phone and called Minesio. I need you to look into something. Marcus Williams, shot 3 months ago in Vernon. Find out everything, who he was, why he was there, who killed him. Minesio's voice was cautious. This connected to our business? That's what I'm finding out. You want me to handle this personally? Yes. And Minesio? Be discreet. He ended the call and looked at Naomi's card again. This was a mistake. He knew it with the same certainty he knew his own name. Getting involved with her, even peripherally, would complicate everything. But he picked up the card anyway and slipped it into his wallet. 3 years of nothing. One touch, and everything changed. He wasn't sure if that made him lucky or cursed. The next 2 days passed in their usual rhythm. Jinwoo managed his empire with the same cold efficiency that had made him feared and respected in equal measure. He met with suppliers, resolved disputes, made decisions about money and territory and lives. But underneath the familiar routine, something had shifted. He found himself thinking about Naomi Williams at odd moments, wondering what she was doing, whether she was at the hospital saving lives while he was in meetings deciding how to end them. Minesio came to him on the 3rd day with information. They met at a Korean barbecue restaurant Jinwoo owned in the valley, ostensibly for dinner, but really because the private room was swept for bugs twice daily. Minesio was 35, 5 years younger than Jinwoo, whip-smart, and loyal to a fault. He'd been with Jinwoo since the beginning, since they were both low-level enforcers for the previous boss. When Jinwoo had taken over, through methods that weren't discussed in polite company, Minesio had been the first to pledge his loyalty. Marcus Williams was clean, Minesio said, flipping through a tablet. No record, no connections to any organization, no debts. The kid was exactly what his sister said, a good student with a bright future. So, what was he doing in Vernon? That's where it gets interesting. Minesio swiped to another screen. The warehouse where he was shot is owned by a shell company. Took some digging, but that shell company traces back to Lee Sangmin. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. Lee Sangmin was a problem. He ran operations in Long Beach, primarily smuggling, and he'd been pushing into territory that wasn't his for the past year. Jinwoo had been patient, had sent warnings, but Lee was either stupid or ambitious enough to think he could challenge Jinwoo's authority. What was Lee running through that warehouse? Pharmaceuticals, best we can tell. Not street drugs, prescription stuff, mostly opioids, some experimental medications. He's been stealing from hospital shipments, reselling to crooked doctors and online markets. Jinwoo processed this. Marcus Williams was a medical student. Smart, with access to labs and people in the medical field. Lee was using him. That's my guess. Maybe Marcus found out about the operation, maybe Lee tried to recruit him, maybe Marcus saw something he shouldn't have. Either way, Lee eliminated a loose end. Do we have proof? Nothing that would hold up in court, but I've got testimony from one of Lee's guys who says he was there that night. He's willing to talk, but he's scared. Lee's people know we're asking questions now. Jinwoo was quiet for a moment, thinking. By rights, he should stay out of this. Lee's operation had nothing to do with him directly, and getting involved would mean escalation, possibly war. But Lee had killed an innocent kid in Jinwoo's territory, had been running an unauthorized operation right under his nose, and that was disrespect Jinwoo couldn't tolerate. Besides, he'd promised Naomi answers. Set up a meeting with Lee, Jinwoo said. Tell him I want to discuss his Long Beach operations. Make it friendly. Minaseo nodded, unsurprised. And if he refuses? He won't. He'll think I'm offering partnership. Are you? No. They finished dinner discussing logistics, but Jinwoo's mind was already working through scenarios. He needed to handle Lee carefully. Open warfare was expensive and drew attention from law enforcement. Better to apply pressure, make Lee understand that his position was untenable, force him out or force him to make a mistake. After Minaseo left, Jinwoo sat alone in the private room, his phone in his hand. He should wait until he had more information before contacting Naomi. But he found himself pulling up her number anyway, staring at it. It was just business, he told himself. He was updating a concerned citizen about an investigation. Nothing more. He typed out a message. This is Jinwoo Park. I have some information about your brother. Can we meet? Her response came within minutes. When and where? Tomorrow evening. 7 p.m. The Lotus Club. I'll be there. Jinwoo set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. He was playing a dangerous game, and not just with Lee Sangmin. Every interaction with Naomi was a risk. Every moment in her presence reminded him of what his body could do now, what it had been unable to do for so long. The shame of those 3 years sat heavy on him, a weight he carried in silence. His reputation in the organization had suffered. Men gossiped, and in their world, inability to perform sexually was seen as weakness. He'd overheard comments, carefully worded so they could be denied if confronted, about whether his injury had taken his manhood, whether he was still fit to lead. He'd killed the 2 men who'd been most vocal about it. Not immediately, not in a way that could be traced back to their disrespect, but he'd had them eliminated within 6 months. It had sent a message, but it hadn't stopped the whispers entirely. Nothing would stop those except proof that he was still a man in every sense of the word. And there was the trap. Because if Naomi was the key, if she was the one person who could unlock what had been frozen in him, then being with her meant exposing his vulnerability. It meant admitting the problem existed. It meant trusting someone with his deepest shame. Jinwoo didn't trust easily, and he certainly didn't expose weakness. In his world, weakness got you killed. But the alternative was 3 more years of the half-life he'd been living. 3 more years of avoiding intimacy, of watching his subordinates exchange glances when he left events alone, of feeling like something vital had been carved out of him and buried somewhere he couldn't retrieve it. Jinwoo stood and straightened his jacket. Tomorrow he would see Naomi again. He would give her information about her brother. And he would figure out what to do about the fact that his body wanted her in a way it hadn't wanted anyone since the night a bullet had grazed his spine and changed everything. For now, he had work to do. He had an empire to run and a rival to outmaneuver. The personal could wait. It had to wait. But as he left the restaurant and climbed into the back of his car, he found himself thinking about the way Naomi had looked at him in his office, direct and unafraid. He thought about her hands, steady and capable, the hands of someone who saved lives. He thought about what those hands might feel like on his skin, and for the first time in 3 years, the thought didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with something far more dangerous. Hope. Naomi arrived at the Lotus Club at 6:55, early enough to observe, but not so early it looked desperate. She'd traded her nurse's scrubs for dark jeans and a leather jacket, practical clothes that wouldn't restrict movement if things went wrong. She didn't expect them to, not really. Jinwoo Park might be dangerous, but their last meeting had been civil, almost cordial. Still, she hadn't survived Compton by being careless, and she wasn't about to start now. James, the bartender from her first visit, recognized her immediately and waved her toward the back hallway. This time she knew the way. The elevator ride up to Jinwoo's office felt longer than it had before, maybe because she was less focused on her grief and more aware of what she was walking into. She'd spent the past 3 days learning everything she could about Jinwoo Park, and what she'd learned had been both impressive and terrifying. He'd taken control of the Korean organized crime operations in Los Angeles 7 years ago, at 33 years old, in what some people called a coup and others called a necessary evolution. The previous boss had been old school, brutal and careless, drawing too much police attention. Jinwoo had promised the other families stability and profit, and he delivered. Under his leadership, operations had become more sophisticated, more profitable, and far less visible to law enforcement. He was known for being smart, ruthless when necessary, but not needlessly violent. He kept his word, paid his debts, and demanded absolute loyalty in return. He was also, if the rumors were true, deeply private. No wife, no obvious girlfriend, no public entanglements. Some people whispered that he was married to the business, others that he had someone hidden away somewhere, a secret life away from the chaos. Naomi found the mystery intriguing despite herself. Men like Jinwoo Park didn't usually interest her. She'd seen what power and violence did to people, how it hollowed them out until there was nothing left but the performance of strength. But there had been something in his eyes during their meeting, a flicker of something human underneath the cold exterior. The elevator doors opened. Jinwoo was standing by the windows, his back to her, looking out over Koreatown. He turned when he heard her step into the office, and Naomi felt that same jolt of awareness she'd felt during their first meeting. He was handsome in an austere way, all clean lines and controlled power, dressed in black on black with a precision that spoke of careful attention to image. But it was his eyes that held her, dark and intelligent and currently focused entirely on her. Ms. Williams. Thank you for coming. Naomi, please. She moved into the room, noting that he'd set out 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey on the low table by the leather couches. And thank you for looking into Marcus. Jinwoo gestured to the couch. Please sit. Would you like a drink? Yes. She needed something to do with her hands, and the way he was looking at her was making her more nervous than she wanted to admit. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each glass and handed her one before sitting in the chair across from her, maintaining distance. Professional. Safe. I had my people investigate your brother's death, Jinwoo said without preamble. You were right. He wasn't involved in drugs, and he didn't end up in Vernon by accident. Naomi leaned forward, her whiskey forgotten. What happened? There's a man named Lee Sangmin. He runs operations in Long Beach, primarily smuggling pharmaceuticals. Prescription medications, mostly opioids, some experimental drugs. He's been stealing from hospital shipments and reselling through various channels. And Marcus. We believe Lee tried to recruit your brother. Marcus had access to USC's medical facilities, connections with doctors and researchers. He would have been valuable to Lee's operation. Jinwoo's voice was careful, measured. We think Marcus refused, or possibly discovered something about Lee's operation that made him a liability. So Lee killed him. Yes. The word hung in the air between them. Naomi felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. She'd known, on some level, that this was the truth. But hearing it confirmed, having a name and a face to put to her brother's killer, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Can you prove it? Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened on the glass. Not in a way that would convince the police or hold up in court. But I have testimony from someone who was there that night. Someone who saw what happened. I want to talk to them. Jinwoo shook his head. That's not possible. The witness is in protective custody and won't testify publicly. They're too afraid of Lee's retaliation. Then what am I supposed to do with this information? Naomi heard the edge in her own voice. Just accept that I know who killed Marcus, but can't do anything about it? I didn't say you can't do anything about it. Naomi studied Jinwoo's face, trying to read what he wasn't saying. You're going to handle it yourself. Lee Sangmin has been operating in my territory without permission. He's been running an unauthorized operation and killed an innocent person to cover it up. These are insults I can't ignore, regardless of your brother's involvement. So this is about respect, not justice. In my world, they're often the same thing. Jinwoo met her eyes steadily. Lee will answer for what he's done. That's all I can promise you. Naomi wanted to argue, wanted to demand more, wanted to be the one to make Lee Sangmin pay for what he'd done to Marcus. But she could see in Jinwoo's expression that this was as far as he would bend. He was offering her vengeance, just not by her hand. When? She asked. Soon. These things take time. Lee is careful, well protected. I need to approach this correctly. I want to be there when it happens. No. The word was flat, absolute. You're a civilian, Naomi. You don't belong in this. He killed my brother. I understand that. But putting you in harm's way doesn't honor Marcus's memory. It just risks creating another tragedy. Jinwoo leaned forward slightly. Let me handle this my way. When it's done, I'll tell you. You'll have closure. But you need to trust me and stay out of it. Naomi wanted to refuse. Every instinct in her body screamed against letting someone else fight her battles. But she also wasn't stupid. She was a nurse, not a gangster. She'd done well to get this far, to find out what happened to Marcus and identify his killer. Going further, trying to involve herself in whatever Jinwoo was planning, would likely get her killed and accomplish nothing. Fine, she said finally. But I want updates. I want to know what's happening. Agreed. Jinwoo picked up his whiskey and took a sip. I'll keep you informed. They sat in silence for a moment. Naomi found herself studying him, this man who lived in a world of violence, but spoke with such careful control. He was attractive, she admitted to herself. Not just physically, though there was that too, but in the way he carried himself, the intelligence in his eyes, the sense of coiled power held in check. She wondered what it would take to see him lose that control, to crack the careful mask he wore. Can I ask you something? She said. Jinwoo nodded. You can ask. Why are you helping me? You said Lee was operating in your territory, that this is about respect. But you could have handled that without ever telling me what you found. Why bring me into it? Jinwoo was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it. Because your brother was innocent. Because you came to me looking for truth, not revenge. Because I respect what you're trying to do for him. He paused. And because everyone deserves to know why they lost someone they love. There was something in his tone, something personal, that made Naomi wonder if he was speaking from experience. Before she could ask, he stood, clearly ending the conversation. I should let you get back to your life. I'll be in touch soon. Naomi stood as well, recognizing a dismissal when she heard one. But as she moved toward the door, she turned back. Jinwoo. He looked up at the sound of his first name. She'd used it without thinking, dropping the formality of Mr. Park, and something shifted in the air between them at the presumption of familiarity. Thank you, she said simply. For looking into this. For taking it seriously. You're welcome. She left, and Jinwoo stood alone in his office, listening to the elevator descend. His body was responding to her presence again, that same unwelcome rush of physical awareness that had surprised him the first time. He'd managed to keep his composure throughout their conversation, but it had taken effort. Being near her, watching the way she moved, hearing the passion in her voice when she talked about her brother, all of it affected him in ways he couldn't afford. He needed to be careful. Getting involved with Naomi Williams, even just as an ally in her quest for justice, was dangerous for reasons that had nothing to do with Lee Sangmin. She represented hope, the possibility that his body might work again, that he might be whole again. But hope was the cruelest emotion in his world. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope made you weak. Jinwoo picked up his phone and called Min SEO. Accelerate the timeline on Lee. I want this handled within the week. If Min SEO was surprised by the urgency, he didn't show it. I'll make it happen. Jinwoo ended the call and returned to the windows, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, Naomi was driving home, believing that he was helping her out of some sense of honor or justice. She didn't know the truth, that he was doing this as much for himself as for her, that he needed to prove to himself that he could still be the man he'd been before the injury, that he could still protect, still act, still matter in ways that went beyond giving orders and collecting money. 3 years ago, a deal had gone wrong. A rival organization had tried to ambush Jinwoo during a meeting, and in the chaos that followed, bullets had flown. Jinwoo had taken one in his side, another that grazed his lower spine. He'd survived, had killed 3 of the ambushers himself before his men secured the area. But in the months that followed, as his physical wounds healed, he discovered the hidden damage. His body no longer responded sexually. Not to touch, not to visual stimulation, not to anything. The doctors had run every test, found nothing conclusive, suggested it was psychological trauma from the attack. Jinwoo hadn't believed them, but he'd stopped seeking medical help anyway. What was the point? Whether the cause was physical or mental, the result was the same. He was broken in a way that mattered, in a way that defined masculinity in his culture and his world. He'd withdrawn from anything resembling intimacy, had constructed walls around himself that no one could breach. Until Naomi. Until this woman who looked at him without fear, who challenged him without calculation, who somehow reached past all his defenses without even trying. He didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know if he should pursue it or run from it. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than numbness when he thought about touching someone. And that terrified him more than any gun ever had. The meeting with Lee Sang-min took place 4 days later at a restaurant in Long Beach, neutral territory chosen carefully. Lee arrived with 2 bodyguards, both young and obviously armed. Jinwoo came with Min Seo and 1 other man, a veteran named Sung-ho who'd been with the organization for 20 years. The imbalance in experience was deliberate. Jinwoo wanted Lee to feel confident, wanted him to think this was a negotiation between equals. Lee was in his 40s, heavy-set, with the kind of face that looked friendly until you looked at his eyes. He greeted Jinwoo with excessive warmth, all smiles and bows, playing the role of gracious host even though this wasn't his restaurant. They made small talk through the first course, discussing business conditions, market trends, all the polite fictions that men in their positions maintained. So, Lee said finally, setting down his chopsticks. You wanted to discuss my Long Beach operations. I'm flattered by your interest. Jinwoo smiled, cold and precise. I'm interested in understanding what operations you have in my territory. The atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. Lee's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. I wasn't aware that Long Beach was your territory exclusively. The families agreed. The families agreed to the boundaries 7 years ago, when I took over. Long Beach docks are yours. Long Beach distribution is yours. But warehouses in Vernon are mine. Pharmaceutical operations stealing from hospitals in Inglewood and LA are mine. You've been crossing lines, Lee. Lee's bodyguards tensed, hands moving subtly toward their weapons. Min Seo and Sung-ho remained perfectly still, but Jinwoo knew they were ready. He kept his eyes on Lee, his expression neutral, giving away nothing. Those are serious accusations, Lee said carefully. Based on what evidence? Based on the evidence I need to be convinced. Based on the fact that you've been operating in my territory without permission and without profit sharing. Based on the fact that you killed an innocent civilian to protect your operation. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus Williams. Shot 3 months ago outside your warehouse in Vernon. A medical student who had nothing to do with our world until you tried to involve him. Lee's face remained impassive, but Jinwoo saw the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of how much Jinwoo knew and how much damage it could do. Even if such a thing had happened, which I'm not admitting, the death of one civilian wouldn't be worth risking our relationship over. It would if that civilian's sister came to me asking questions. It would if her questions led me to discover an unauthorized operation in my territory. It would if I found out that you've been showing me disrespect for months while pretending to be an ally. The words were delivered calmly, but everyone at the table understood the threat. Lee's smile finally faded. What do you want, Jinwoo? I want you to shut down your pharmaceutical operation immediately. I want you to leave Vernon entirely. I want you to pay me restitution for using my territory without permission, 50% of your profits from the past year. And I want you to understand that if you ever cross into my territory again without explicit permission, there will be consequences. Lee's jaw tightened. That's not a negotiation. That's a surrender. Yes, Jinwoo agreed. It is. For a long moment, Lee said nothing. Jinwoo could see him weighing his options, considering whether he could fight, whether he could win, whether the cost of resisting would be worth it. Finally, Lee nodded slowly. You're making a mistake. I have allies. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Jinwoo stood, Min Seo and Sung-ho rising with him. You have 1 week to comply with my terms. After that, I stop being polite. They left the restaurant, Lee's furious gaze burning into Jinwoo's back. Once they were in the car, Min Seo let out a low whistle. That went well. He won't comply, Sung-ho said from the driver's seat. He's too proud. I know, Jinwoo said. But I gave him the chance. What happens next is on him. They drove in silence for a few minutes before Min Seo spoke again. The sister. You're doing this for her. It wasn't a question, but Jinwoo answered anyway. I'm doing this because Lee was operating in my territory without permission. The sister is incidental. Min Seo didn't argue, but Jinwoo could see he didn't believe it. The truth was somewhere in between. Yes, Lee's unauthorized operation was a legitimate problem that needed to be addressed. But Jinwoo also couldn't deny that Naomi's involvement had accelerated his timeline, had made him more aggressive in his approach. He wanted to give her closure. He wanted to be the man who solved her problem, who gave her what the police couldn't. He wanted to see how she looked at him when he told her that Lee had been handled. It was vanity, he realized. Male pride. The desire to impress a woman he was attracted to. He'd thought those impulses had died with his ability to act on them, but apparently they'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right person to wake them up. That night, Jinwoo texted Naomi an update. Met with Lee today. He's been given an ultimatum. This should be resolved soon. Her response was immediate. What kind of ultimatum? The kind that gives him a choice between cooperation and consequences. He has 1 week. And if he doesn't cooperate, then he faces the consequences. There was a pause before her next message. You're going to kill him. Jinwoo stared at the text. He could lie, could give her some vague reassurance that justice would be served without violence. But something about Naomi demanded honesty. If necessary, he typed. Would that bother you? Another pause, longer this time. I don't know, she finally replied. 3 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now, after everything I've learned about what happened to Marcus? I honestly don't know. You don't have to know. You just have to let me handle it. I trust you. Those 3 words hit Jinwoo harder than they should have. Trust wasn't something he took lightly, and hearing it from Naomi felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Get some rest, he typed. I'll update you when there's news. Good night, Jinwoo. He set the phone down and sat in the darkness of his apartment, a penthouse in downtown LA that he'd bought for the view and the security, but had never really made into a home. Trust. She trusted him. A woman who barely knew him, who'd walked into his world with nothing but determination and grief, had decided he was worthy of her trust. Jinwoo wondered what she would think if she knew the whole truth about him. Not just the criminal empire and the violence, but the private shame, the 3 years of dysfunction, the nights he'd spent wondering if he'd ever feel whole again. Would she still trust him if she knew how broken he was? Would she still look at him with those clear, direct eyes if she understood that every conversation they had, every moment in her presence, was torture of a different kind? He didn't know. And he wasn't sure he was brave enough to find out. Lee Sang-min did not take the week to consider Jinwoo's ultimatum. 3 days later, Min Seo called with news that Lee had tried to hit one of Jinwoo's supply lines, a direct act of war. The attack had failed, Jinwoo's people had been prepared for exactly this kind of response, but 2 of his men had been injured in the firefight, and a shipment worth $500,000 had been destroyed. He's escalating, Min Seo said. He's not going to back down. Jinwoo had expected this. Men like Lee didn't rise to power by being reasonable. They rose by being stubborn, aggressive, willing to fight even when the smart play was to fold. Where is he now? Holed up in his compound in Torrance. He's brought in extra security, maybe 20 men. He knows we're coming. Then we don't come directly. We cut off his supply lines, freeze his assets, make life difficult for his allies. We squeeze until he has no choice but to come out. Jinwoo paused. And Minacio? No more restraint. He made his choice. Over the next week, Jinwoo dismantled Lee's operation with surgical precision. Bank accounts were frozen, suppliers stopped taking his calls, allies suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. Lee's legitimate businesses, the restaurants and shops he used to launder money, started facing health inspections, fire code violations, tax audits. The pressure was relentless, inescapable, and entirely legal on the surface. But underneath, in the world that operated by different rules, Jinwoo's people were also working. Shipments disappeared. Drivers quit without explanation. Key members of Lee's organization started reaching out to Jinwoo's people, looking for better opportunities. The structure that Lee had built over years began to crumble in days. Jinwoo kept Naomi updated throughout, careful messages that gave her enough information to understand progress without dragging her into the specifics. She never asked for details, seemed to understand instinctively where the line was between knowing and being complicit. But she thanked him after every update, small messages of gratitude that Jinwoo read more times than he should. 10 days after the meeting at the restaurant, Lee made a desperate mistake. He tried to negotiate with Jinwoo's rival, a Chinese organization that controlled parts of San Gabriel Valley. It was a suicidal move. The Chinese respected Jinwoo, had a profitable working relationship with him, and they weren't about to jeopardize that for someone as small-time as Lee. They informed Jinwoo of Lee's approach within hours. He's offering them 20% of his territory if they back him against you, Minacio reported. Obviously, they declined. Did they tell Lee they were declining? Not yet. They're waiting for your instruction. Jinwoo thought for a moment. Tell them to accept the meeting. Tell them to set it at the port of Long Beach, the old warehouse district. We'll handle it from there. You're going to use it as a trap. Lee wants allies. Let him think he's found them. Let him come out of his hole. 3 days later, Lee Sangmin arrived at the abandoned warehouse complex with 6 men, clearly expecting to meet with Chinese representatives. Instead, he found Jinwoo waiting for him with twice as many, including several members of the Chinese organization who'd agreed to be present as a show of unity. The look on Lee's face when he realized what had happened would have been funny under different circumstances. Instead, it was just sad. He'd miscalculated badly, had let pride and stubbornness override common sense, and now he was standing in an empty warehouse facing the consequences of his choices. Jinwoo, Lee said, trying to maintain composure even as his men shifted nervously behind him. We can still work this out. No, we can't. Jinwoo walked forward, stopping about 10 feet from Lee. I gave you a chance, Lee. I offered you terms that would have let you keep your life and some dignity. You chose war instead. That was your mistake. I have information, Lee said desperately. Things about your organization, about your operations. If anything happens to me, that information goes to the FBI. No, it doesn't. Jinwoo's voice was flat, certain. Because if you had that kind of insurance, you would have used it already. You're bluffing, and we both know it. Lee's hand moved toward his jacket, a reflexive gesture born of panic. That's all it took. Minacio and the others had their weapons out instantly, trained on Lee and his men. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of foghorns from the port. Don't, Jinwoo said quietly. You've lost, Lee. How this ends is still your choice, but the outcome is decided. For a long moment, Lee stood frozen, his hand halfway to his weapon, his men waiting for orders that didn't come. Finally, his shoulders sagged, defeat written across his features. What do you want? Answers. Then you leave Los Angeles. You give up everything, your operations, your territory, your assets. You disappear, and you never come back. That's the only deal I'm offering now. And if I refuse? Jinwoo didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lee could see his own fate written in the faces of the men surrounding him, in the cold certainty of Jinwoo's expression, in the simple mathematics of the situation. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of options. Marcus Williams, Jinwoo said. Tell me what happened. Lee closed his eyes briefly. He found out about the pharmaceutical operation. One of my suppliers got careless, used Williams's name on some paperwork without permission. Williams started asking questions, got suspicious. I tried to recruit him, offered him money to help with the medical side of things. He refused, said he was going to report everything to the police. So you killed him. I had him followed. When he went to meet with someone, I don't know who, my men were supposed to scare him, make him understand the stakes. It went wrong. He ran, they panicked, shots were fired. Lee's voice was hollow now, empty. I didn't order his death specifically. But it was my operation, my men. So yes, I killed him. Jinwoo felt something cold settle in his chest. Lee was admitting it was almost an accident, a moment of panic rather than calculated murder. But the result was the same. Marcus Williams was dead because he'd tried to do the right thing, because he'd stumbled into Lee's operation and refused to be corrupted. Thank you for your honesty, Jinwoo said. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed a button. Did you get that? Lee's eyes went wide as he realized what had happened. You recorded me. Yes. Jinwoo held up the phone. Your confession, Lee. Full and complete. I'm going to give this to someone who deserves to hear it. You said I could leave. You said. And you can. But first, you're going to write out everything. The names of the men who were there that night, the details of your operation, everything. You're going to give Marcus Williams's sister the closure she deserves. After that, you leave. You disappear. And if you ever come back, if you ever show your face in California again, I won't be this merciful. Lee looked like he wanted to argue, but the fight had gone out of him. He nodded slowly. Fine. I'll write it down. 2 hours later, Jinwoo sat in his car with a folder containing Lee's written confession and a USB drive with the recording. Lee had been thorough, whether out of fear or resignation Jinwoo didn't know. Every detail, every name, everything Naomi would need to understand what had happened to her brother and why. He texted her. It's done. Can I see you tonight? I get off shift at 11. Meet me at Denny's on La Brea. Jinwoo almost smiled at that. After everything, she wanted to meet at a 24-hour diner. It was so perfectly normal, so far removed from his world, that it felt almost surreal. I'll be there. He arrived at 10:50, found a booth in the back where he could see the door, and ordered coffee he didn't want. Naomi walked in at 11:05, still in her scrubs, her jacket thrown over them. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from a long shift dealing with emergencies and trauma. But when she saw him, something in her expression softened, and she slid into the booth across from him. Long night? Jinwoo asked. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 overdoses, and a kid who fell off a skateboard and cracked his skull. She rubbed her eyes. Just another Tuesday in Inglewood. The waitress came over and Naomi ordered coffee and pancakes. Jinwoo ordered nothing else, content to sit across from her and wait. When the waitress left, Naomi looked at him with those direct eyes of hers, waiting. Jinwoo pulled the folder from his jacket and set it on the table between them. Lee Sang-min's confession. Written and recorded. Everything that happened to Marcus, who was responsible, why it happened. It's all there. Naomi stared at the folder like it might bite her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, pulled it toward her, opened it. Jinwoo watched her face as she read, saw the emotions move across her features, pain, anger, grief, and finally something that might have been relief. When she finished, she closed the folder carefully and looked up at him. It was an accident? The shooting was. The operation that put your brother in danger wasn't. Lee was running an illegal pharmaceutical operation and your brother found out about it. Lee tried to recruit him, Marcus refused and threatened to go to police. Lee had him followed, intended to intimidate him. Things escalated. Jinwoo kept his voice neutral, factual. The men who actually pulled the triggers are named in the confession. Lee's left the city. He won't be coming back. Did you kill him? No. But he knows what will happen if he returns. Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the folder. I thought I'd feel different when I knew. I thought there'd be some kind of closure, some sense of justice. But I just feel tired. That's normal. Knowing doesn't bring him back. No, it doesn't. She looked at him, and there was something in her gaze that made Jinwoo's breath catch. But at least I know. At least he's not just another unsolved case, another black kid the system didn't care enough about. Because of you, I know what happened. I can tell my family. I can. Her voice cracked slightly. I can let him rest. The waitress returned with Naomi's food. She picked at the pancakes without much interest, and Jinwoo found himself wanting to say something comforting, something that would ease the grief still evident in her eyes. But comfort wasn't something he was good at, and empty platitudes would only insult her intelligence. What will you do now? He asked instead. Naomi shrugged. Go back to my life, I guess. Work my shifts, pay my bills, try to figure out how to move forward. She took a sip of coffee. What about you? Back to running your empire. Something like that. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the sounds of the diner filling the space between them. Jinwoo knew he should leave, should let her process this information alone, should put distance between them now that his obligation was fulfilled. But he didn't move, and neither did she. Can I ask you something personal? Naomi said finally. You can ask. Why do you do this? The organized crime, the violence, all of it. You're clearly intelligent, capable. You could do anything. Why this? It was a question Jinwoo had been asked before, usually by law enforcement or rivals trying to understand him. But coming from Naomi, it felt different, like she was genuinely trying to understand rather than judge. Because I'm good at it, he said. Because it's the world I know. Because when I was younger, it was my way out of poverty, and now it's too late to be anything else. I don't believe that last part. You should. Men like me don't retire to peaceful lives. We die in this world or we disappear into it. There's no middle path. That's bleak. That's realistic. Jinwoo met her eyes. I'm not a good man, Naomi. I helped you because it served my interests and because I respected your determination. But don't mistake that for redemption or morality. I've done things that would horrify you. I'll do more things before I'm done. That's who I am. I know who you are. Naomi's voice was steady. I'm not naive, Jinwoo. I did my research. I know what you do, what you've done. But I also know you didn't have to help me. You didn't have to treat me with respect or give me closure. You could have dismissed me or worse. So yes, you're involved in terrible things. But you're also capable of decency when it matters. Jinwoo didn't know what to say to that. The way she looked at him, like she saw both the monster and the man and wasn't afraid of either, unnerved him more than any threat ever had. You should be careful about giving men like me too much credit. And you should be careful about giving yourself too little. She pushed her mostly uneaten pancakes aside. I should get home. Early shift tomorrow. Jinwoo nodded and signaled for the check. He paid despite her protest, and they walked out to the parking lot together. Naomi's car was a beat-up Honda that had clearly seen better days. She unlocked it and turned back to him, and they stood there in the fluorescent glow of the Denny's sign, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Thank you, Naomi said finally. For everything. For taking me seriously when no one else would. For finding the truth. For giving Marcus justice in the only way that was possible. You're welcome. She took a step forward, surprising him, and wrapped her arms around him in a brief, tight hug. Jinwoo froze, his body going rigid with shock. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him, the last time he'd had physical contact that wasn't violent or transactional. And Naomi felt warm and real and present in a way that made his carefully constructed walls tremble. When she pulled back, she was smiling slightly. You're terrible at hugs. I don't get much practice. That's sad. She opened her car door. Take care of yourself, Jinwoo. He watched her drive away, standing alone in the parking lot long after her taillights had disappeared. His body was responding to that brief contact, that innocent hug, in ways that both relieved and terrified him. For 3 years, nothing. And now, twice, Naomi had provoked reactions he'd thought were gone forever. Jinwoo got in his own car and drove home through the empty streets, his mind churning. He should be happy. The Lee situation was resolved, his territory was secure, and he'd given Naomi what she needed. Everything was back to normal. Except nothing felt normal anymore. He felt awake in a way he hadn't in years, aware of possibilities he'd written off as lost. That night, alone in his apartment, Jinwoo made a decision. He pulled out his phone and sent Naomi a text. If you ever want to get coffee sometime, let me know. As friends. No obligations. He regretted it the moment he pressed send. It was too forward, too presumptuous, too revealing of wants he shouldn't have. But it was too late to take back. The message was out there, and all he could do was wait. Naomi's response came 20 minutes later. "I'd like that." Jinwoo stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then he set the phone down and walked to his window, looking out over Los Angeles. Somewhere in this vast city, Naomi was probably getting ready for bed, probably exhausted from her shift and the emotional weight of finally knowing what happened to her brother. And tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever they both had time, they would get coffee. As friends. Jinwoo knew himself well enough to know that friendship wasn't what he wanted. He wanted more, wanted things he couldn't articulate, wanted to see if this spark of physical response could grow into something sustained and real. But wanting something and being able to have it were different things. He was still broken, still carrying 3 years of dysfunction and shame. One unexpected response didn't fix that. It just made the hope more painful. Still, he found himself imagining it. Imagining coffee with Naomi, imagining conversations that went beyond business and grief, imagining what it might be like to know her as a person rather than as someone seeking justice. Imagining, eventually, what it might be like to touch her with intention rather than accident, to see if his body would continue to respond or if it would fail him again at the crucial moment. The fear of that failure was almost paralyzing. But the alternative, letting her slip away without even trying, going back to the safe numbness of the past 3 years, felt worse. So Jinwoo made another decision, one that scared him more than any confrontation with rivals ever had. He would try. He would see where this connection with Naomi led. And if his body failed him, if the shame came rushing back, then at least he would know. At least he would have taken the risk. For now, though, it was enough to have her agreement to coffee. It was enough to have this small seed of possibility planted. Jinwoo went to bed that night feeling something he hadn't felt in years, and it took him a while to identify the emotion. It was anticipation. They met for coffee 4 days later at a small place in Silver Lake, equidistant from Koreatown and Inglewood. Jinwoo arrived first, ordered an Americano, and sat at a table by the window where he could watch the street. Old habits. Always know your exits, always keep your back to the wall, always be ready for things to go wrong. Naomi arrived 10 minutes later wearing jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a way that showed off her face. She looked more rested than she had at Denny's, some of the exhaustion gone from her eyes. She ordered something complicated with caramel and extra foam, and Jinwoo found himself almost smiling at the contrast between her sweet coffee and his bitter one. "So," she said, sitting across from him. "Friends having coffee. This is what normal people do, right?" "I wouldn't know. I'm not normal people." "Neither am I, really. When you grow up the way I did, when you've seen what I've seen, normal becomes relative." She took a sip of her drink. "But I figured we could try." They talked, and Jinwoo found himself relaxing in increments. Naomi asked about his life before the organization, and he told her some of it. Growing up in Seoul, moving to LA when he was 15, the struggle to fit in, the eventual drift into the only community that would accept him. She told him about Compton, about her mother's determination to get her children into better schools, about the sacrifices that had shaped her life. Marcus was supposed to be the one who made it, she said. The success story. I was okay with being the nurse, the steady income, the backup plan. But Marcus was brilliant. He was going to do something important, something that mattered. And then some asshole running a drug operation took that away. You do something important, Jinwoo said. You save lives. Not enough of them. Not the ones that matter most. She looked at him curiously. Do you ever regret it? The choices you made. Every day. But regret doesn't change anything. No, I guess it doesn't. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing easily in a way that surprised Jinwoo. He'd expected awkwardness, the weight of their different worlds creating distance. Instead, they found common ground in unexpected places, both of them shaped by poverty and loss, both of them survivors who'd learned to be hard when necessary but hadn't lost their capacity to care. Naomi made him laugh, something that happened so rarely he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. And when she smiled at something he said, genuinely pleased, Jinwoo felt that same jolt of physical response he'd experienced before. When they finally left the coffee shop, Jinwoo walked her to her car. "I enjoyed this," he said, and meant it. "Me too. We should do it again." "I'd like that." Naomi leaned against her car, studying him. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me if I'm overstepping." "Go ahead. Why don't you have someone?" "A girlfriend, a wife, someone to go home to. You're attractive, successful in your own way, clearly capable of conversation. So why are you alone?" Jinwoo felt his chest tighten. This was the question he'd been dreading, the one that would require either lying or revealing more than he wanted to. "It's complicated. Most things worth talking about are." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. He could deflect, could give her some vague answer about being married to his work. But something about Naomi's directness demanded honesty in return. "I was injured 3 years ago. There were complications. Since then, I've kept my distance from relationships." "What kind of complications?" Jinwoo met her eyes, saw genuine concern there, not judgment or pity. The kind that make intimacy difficult. Understanding dawned on Naomi's face, but instead of the awkwardness he expected, she just nodded slowly. "That must be hard. For someone in your position, with your reputation." "It's been challenging." "Is it medical or psychological?" The doctors couldn't decide. "Probably both." He couldn't believe he was having this conversation, standing in a parking lot in Silver Lake, confessing his deepest shame to a woman he barely knew. But somehow it felt right, felt necessary. "It's not something I talk about." "I appreciate you telling me." Naomi's voice was gentle. "And for what it's worth, that doesn't change how I see you. You're still the man who helped me find out what happened to my brother. You're still the man I just spent 2 hours talking to and enjoying every minute." Jinwoo felt something crack in his chest, some barrier he'd built to protect himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. "I should tell you, being around you, something's different. My body responds to you in ways it hasn't responded to anyone since the injury." Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "Oh. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's real or temporary or if it matters at all. But I thought you should know. Because if we continue spending time together, if this becomes something more than coffee and conversation, that's the reality you'd be dealing with." "I'm not." He struggled for words. "I'm not whole." "Jinwoo." Naomi reached out and took his hand, the contact sending electricity through him. "None of us are whole. We're all walking around with damage and scars and parts that don't work the way they're supposed to. The question isn't whether you're broken. It's whether you're willing to try anyway. And if I fail, then you fail. But at least you tried." She squeezed his hand gently. "I like you. I like talking to you. I like the way you treated me with respect when you didn't have to. If you want to see where this goes, I'm willing. But only if you are." Jinwoo looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast of her dark skin against his, at the simple human connection that meant so much after years of isolation. "I'm willing," he said quietly. "But I need you to understand what you're getting into. My world is dangerous. Being associated with me puts you at risk. I'm a Black woman who grew up in Compton and works as a nurse in Inglewood. I've been at risk my whole life." She smiled slightly. "Besides, I already helped you bring down a criminal operation. Pretty sure I'm already associated with you in ways that matter." He couldn't argue with that. "Then yes. I'd like to see where this goes." "Good." Naomi released his hand and opened her car door. "Call me when you want to do this again." "And Jinwoo? Thank you for being honest with me. I know that wasn't easy." He watched her drive away, his hand still tingling from where she'd touched him. For the first time in 3 years, Jinwoo felt like maybe, possibly, things might be okay. He wasn't healed. He wasn't fixed. But he wasn't alone anymore, and that mattered more than he'd realized. Over the next 3 weeks, Jinwoo and Naomi fell into a rhythm. They met for coffee, for lunch, once for dinner at a Korean restaurant where Jinwoo watched Naomi tackle bulgogi with chopsticks and a determination that made him want to kiss her. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and habits, building something that felt more substantial with each meeting. Jinwoo was careful. He didn't push for physical contact beyond the occasional handhold or shoulder touch. He was terrified of rushing things, of putting himself in a position where his body might fail and destroy this fragile thing they were building. But Naomi seemed content with the slow pace, never pressuring him, always letting him set the boundaries. His organization noticed, of course. Minaseo made subtle comments about how Jinwoo seemed different lately, lighter somehow. Sungho, ever observant, asked once if there was someone new in Jinwoo's life and seemed satisfied when Jinwoo gave him a non-committal answer. The rank-and-file members gossiped, but Jinwoo shut that down quickly. His private life was private, and anyone who suggested otherwise would find themselves out of the organization entirely. What worried him more was the attention from outside. His world operated on the principle that information was power, and information about who he spent time with could be weaponized. He was careful about where he met Naomi, varied the locations, always made sure they weren't followed. But he knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed, before his relationship with her became public knowledge. That moment came 5 weeks after their first coffee date. Jinwoo was in a meeting with some of his captains when Minaseo burst in, his face tight with concern. "We have a situation." Jinwoo excused himself and followed Minaseo to a private office. "What is it?" "Someone took photos of you and the Williams woman. Multiple meetings over the past month." Minaseo pulled up images on his tablet, Jinwoo and Naomi at the coffee shop, at the Korean restaurant, walking together through Grand Park. They were discreet photos, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, but clear enough to identify both of them. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. "Who took them?" "We're still tracking that down. But they've been circulated to several of our rivals. People know you're involved with her." "Fuck." Jinwoo ran a hand through his hair. "She becomes a target." "Yes. Especially given her connection to the Lee situation. People put it together, you went after Lee for her, you dismantled his organization because of what happened to her brother. That makes you look weak." "I don't care how it makes me look." "I know. But others do. And they'll see her as leverage." Minaseo's voice was gentle. "You need to either end this or protect her properly. Half measures will get her killed." Jinwoo knew Minaseo was right, but that didn't make the choice any easier. He could walk away from Naomi, could cut ties cleanly and completely, return to the safe isolation he'd maintained for years. It would protect her, remove her from the dangerous orbit of his world. But it would also destroy something real and valuable, something he'd started to believe might actually heal him. Or he could protect her. Bring her deeper into his world, assign bodyguards, make it clear that she was under his protection and harming her would mean war. But that meant fully involving her in a life she'd never chosen, putting her at permanent risk, changing everything about how she lived. "I need to talk to her," Jinwoo said. "Do it soon. People are already asking questions." That night, Jinwoo called Naomi and asked if he could come to her apartment. She agreed immediately, sensing the urgency in his voice. When he arrived, she was waiting with tea and concern, and Jinwoo found himself torn between wanting to protect her from this news and knowing she deserved the truth. He told her everything: the photos, the circulation among his rivals, the target this put on her back. Naomi listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as he talked. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So, what are my options?" she asked finally. "We end this. I disappear from your life. You go back to being a civilian with no connections to my world. You'd be safe. And the other option? I protect you. You get bodyguards, your movements are monitored, your safety becomes a priority for my organization. But that means accepting that you're part of this world now, that your life won't be normal anymore. Those are both terrible options." "I know. I'm sorry. This is my fault. I should have been more careful, should have seen this coming." Naomi set down her tea and looked at him directly. "Jinwoo, I'm a black woman in America. I've never been safe. I've dealt with threats and violence my whole life, just different kinds. At least with you, I know where the danger is coming from. This isn't the same thing." "You're right, it's not. But it's also not your decision to make alone." She moved closer to him on the couch. "I care about you. These past few weeks have been some of the best I've had in a long time. So yes, I'm scared. Yes, this is dangerous. But I'm not ready to walk away just because it got complicated. You could die, Naomi. People in my world die for less than being close to someone like me. People in my world die for walking home at night or sitting in their cars or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. At least if I'm with you, I know what I'm facing. She took his hand. I'm not asking you to protect me from everything. I'm asking you to teach me how to stay safe, how to be smart about this. I can handle it, Jinwoo. But I need you to trust me. Jinwoo wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she didn't understand, that she was being naive. But looking at her face, seeing the steel in her expression alongside the fear, he realized she understood perfectly. She'd made her choice with eyes open, knowing the risks, deciding he was worth it anyway. Okay, he said finally. But we do this my way. You get security, you learn how to spot threats, you check in with me or Min SEO if anything feels wrong. You don't take unnecessary risks. I can agree to that. And Naomi? This gets worse before it gets better. Once people know you're under my protection, some will back off. But others will see you as a challenge, a way to get to me. You need to be prepared for that. I am. She squeezed his hand. I've been through hard things before. I can handle this too. Jinwoo pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a way he hadn't allowed himself before. She fit against him perfectly, her head resting on his shoulder, her body warm and real and present. He felt his own body responding, heat spreading through him, desire mixing with fear and protectiveness in a combination that was almost overwhelming. I don't want you to get hurt because of me, he said quietly. Then make sure I don't. Naomi pulled back enough to look at him. I trust you, Jinwoo. You've proven I can. So protect me if you have to, but don't treat me like I'm fragile. I'm stronger than I look. I know you are. They sat together in silence for a while, the weight of the decision settling over them. Jinwoo knew this was a turning point, that their relationship had just shifted from something tentative and exploratory to something real and dangerous. But looking at Naomi, feeling her warmth against him, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The next morning, Jinwoo assigned 2 of his most trusted men to Naomi's security. Dae-young and Tae-min were both experienced, professional, and, most importantly, loyal to Jinwoo personally. He met with them privately to explain the situation and make it clear that Naomi's safety was their sole responsibility. She's not to know you're always there, Jinwoo said. Be discreet. But if there's any threat, any at all, you eliminate it first and ask questions later. Understood, Dae-young said. He was 40, a veteran of the organization, with the kind of calm competence that came from years of surviving in this world. What about when she's at work? Tae-min asked. He was younger, 32, but sharp and quick to react. The hospital has its own security, but you maintain eyes on the building. If she leaves for any reason, you follow. Jinwoo paused. And if anything happens to her, if either of you lets her get hurt, I'll hold you both personally responsible. They nodded, understanding the implicit threat. Jinwoo didn't make idle threats, and they knew it. Naomi, for her part, adjusted to her new reality with the same practical determination she brought to everything. She met Dae-jung and Tae-min, asked intelligent questions about how the security would work, and then largely ignored their presence. She went to work, came home, lived her life as normally as possible given the circumstances. But Jinwoo could see the toll it took, the way she checked over her shoulder more often, the tension she carried in her shoulders, the moments when fear flickered across her face. They spent more time together after that. Jinwoo found reasons to see her several times a week, partly because he wanted to and partly because he needed to reassure himself she was safe. They talked about their pasts, their fears, their hopes for futures they weren't sure would ever materialize. And slowly, carefully, they began to explore the physical side of their relationship. It started with kisses. Soft at first, tentative, Jinwoo always pulling back before things could go too far. But Naomi was patient, letting him set the pace, never pushing for more than he was ready to give. And gradually, over weeks, Jinwoo's confidence grew. His body continued to respond to her, consistently and reliably in a way it hadn't since the injury. The fear of failure never quite went away, but it receded, became manageable. 2 months after the photos had been taken, Jinwoo invited Naomi to his apartment for the first time. She walked through the space with interest, taking in the minimalist furniture and expensive art, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their view of downtown LA. "This is very you," she said. "Controlled and beautiful and just a little bit cold. I don't spend much time here. I can tell." She turned to face him. "It doesn't feel lived in. It feels like a hotel." "That's what it is, essentially. A place to sleep between obligations." Naomi moved closer to him, and Jinwoo felt his heart rate kick up. They'd been building to this, had been dancing around it for weeks, and they both knew tonight was different. Tonight was about crossing a threshold they couldn't uncross. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," Jinwoo admitted. "Me too." She took his hand. "But I think we can be terrified together." He led her to the bedroom, his mind racing with every possible way this could go wrong. What if his body failed now at the crucial moment? What if 3 years of dysfunction had just been taking a break, waiting to humiliate him when it mattered most? What if he disappointed her, proved unworthy of the trust she'd placed in him? But Naomi seemed to sense his spiral of anxiety. She stopped him at the edge of the bed and cupped his face in her hands. "Jinwoo, look at me." He met her eyes, saw understanding and patience there. "This isn't a performance," she said gently. "This isn't a test you have to pass. It's just us, figuring this out together. Whatever happens, however this goes, it's okay. We have time. I haven't been with anyone in 3 years. I know. And I haven't been with anyone in almost 2. We're both out of practice." She smiled slightly. "So let's just take it slow and see what feels right. No pressure. No expectations. Just us." Jinwoo kissed her then, pouring into it all the gratitude and fear and desire he couldn't articulate. Naomi responded with equal intensity, her hands moving to his shoulders, pulling him closer. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, and Jinwoo tried to memorize every moment, the way she looked in the dim light of his bedroom, the way her skin felt under his hands, the small sounds she made when he touched her in places that made her shiver. His body cooperated, responding to her in ways that felt like a miracle. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it was overshadowed by the sheer relief of discovering that yes, this still worked. He was still capable of this fundamental human connection. They moved together carefully, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, and when Jinwoo finally entered her, he felt something in his chest crack open, some frozen part of himself thawing after years of cold isolation. Afterward, they lay tangled together in his bed, both breathing hard, both quiet with their own thoughts. Jinwoo held Naomi close, afraid that if he let go, this would all turn out to be a dream, another cruel trick his mind was playing on him. But she was real, solid and warm in his arms, and when she tilted her head up to look at him, her smile was genuine. "You okay?" she asked. "Better than okay." Jinwoo's voice was rough with emotion he didn't quite know how to process. "I didn't think. I thought I'd lost this forever." "You haven't lost anything. You just had to find the right person to help you remember." Naomi pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. For what it's worth, that was pretty amazing for someone who claimed to be out of practice. Jinwoo almost laughed, the sound surprising him. "You're good for my ego. Someone has to be. You spend too much time being intimidating and powerful. You need someone to remind you that you're human too." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Jinwoo slept more soundly than he had in years. For the first time since the injury, he felt whole. Not healed, he knew the psychological scars would take longer to fade than the physical, but whole in the ways that mattered. Naomi had given him back something he'd thought was lost forever, and he wasn't sure he could ever adequately thank her for that. The next morning, Jinwoo woke to find Naomi already up, standing by the windows in one of his shirts, looking out over the city. He watched her for a moment, struck by how right she looked in his space, how natural. Then she turned and saw him awake, and her face broke into a smile that made his chest tight. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." Jinwoo got up and crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "How long have you been up?" "About an hour. I tried to go back to sleep but couldn't. Too much to think about." She leaned back against him. I should get home soon. I have a shift tonight. Stay for breakfast at least. They made breakfast together, moving around Jinwoo's rarely used kitchen with surprising coordination. Naomi told him about her week, about a particularly difficult case at the hospital, about her plans to visit Marcus's grave soon. Jinwoo listened, contributing where appropriate, mostly just content to be in her presence and know that last night had been real. When it was time for her to leave, they stood at his door, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "When can I see you again?" Jinwoo asked. "Whenever you want. I'm off this weekend. Then I'll call you." He kissed her, long and deep, trying to convey everything he felt and couldn't say. When they pulled apart, Naomi was smiling. "You're going to spoil me with all this affection." "Good." He watched her leave, then called Dae-young to make sure her security was in place. Only when he received confirmation that she was safely on her way home did Jinwoo allow himself to relax. He returned to his apartment and stood where Naomi had stood, looking out over Los Angeles, feeling the weight of what had changed. For 3 years, he'd been half alive, going through the motions of power and control while feeling dead inside. Naomi had changed that. She'd walked into his world with determination and grief, and somehow managed to reach past all his carefully constructed defenses to the broken man underneath. She'd given him back his body, his confidence, his sense of being whole. And in return, he'd brought danger into her life, made her a target, pulled her into a world where people died for far less than caring about someone. Jinwoo didn't know if that was a fair trade. But looking at the city spread out before him, knowing Naomi was out there somewhere living her life, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers came, at least he was alive again. At least he felt something. That, he thought, was worth almost anything. The peace lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Jinwoo and Naomi building their relationship, learning to navigate the complexities of his world and her demands, finding moments of normalcy amid the chaos. Then Min Seo came to him with news that made Jinwoo's blood run cold. Lee Sangmin's cousin is in town. Park Jae-sung. He's making noise about avenging family honor. Jinwoo set down the report he'd been reading. How serious? Serious enough. Jae-sung's not like Lee. He's smarter, more strategic. And he's brought muscle with him from Korea. Professional guys, not street thugs. Min Seo pulled up information on his tablet. He's been reaching out to other organizations, building alliances, positioning himself to come at you hard. Over Lee? Lee left with his life. That should be the end of it. Except Lee didn't tell his family the whole story. According to Jae-sung, you destroyed Lee's operation over a woman, made him look weak, forced him into exile. The family sees that as disrespect that needs to be answered. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. He'd known forcing Lee out might have consequences, but he'd hoped the message would be clear enough to prevent retaliation. Apparently, he'd underestimated family loyalty. What's Jae-sung's next move? Unknown. But he's been asking questions about Naomi Williams. A lot of questions. That was it. The line that couldn't be crossed. Jinwoo stood, his expression going cold. Increase her security. Dae-jung and Taemin aren't enough. I want a full team, rotating shifts, complete coverage. Already done. But Jinwoo, if Jae-sung is seriously planning to use her as leverage, then he signs his own death warrant. Jinwoo's voice was flat, absolutely certain. Make that clear to anyone who asks. Naomi Williams is under my direct protection. Anyone who touches her, threatens her, or even looks at her wrong answers to me personally. Min Seo nodded, unsurprised. You're going to war over her. If necessary. The families won't like it. They'll say you're letting personal feelings override business judgment. Then they can say it to my face. Jinwoo met Min Seo's eyes. I don't care what they think. I don't care about politics or perception. Naomi doesn't get hurt. That's the only priority that matters. Min Seo left to coordinate security, and Jinwoo sat alone in his office, thinking. He needed to talk to Naomi, needed to warn her that the threat level had escalated. But he also dreaded the conversation. Every time he had to remind her of the danger his world posed, he felt like he was failing her in some fundamental way. He called her that evening. We need to talk. That's never a good way to start a conversation, Naomi said, but there was worry in her voice. What happened? Not over the phone. Can I come to you? I'm at work until midnight. But you can meet me after. Jinwoo spent the next few hours dealing with business, but his mind was only half present. The rest of him was calculating scenarios, thinking through Jae-sung's possible moves, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of a man he'd never met but already knew was dangerous. At midnight, he was waiting outside Inglewood Hospital when Naomi emerged with 2 nurses he didn't recognize. She said goodbye to them and walked to where Jinwoo was leaning against his car, Dae-young and Taemin visible in a vehicle nearby. Her security had doubled, and she noticed immediately. For guards now, she said. That bad? That bad. Jinwoo opened the car door for her. Let's go somewhere we can talk. They drove to the beach, to a parking lot overlooking the ocean where Jinwoo knew they wouldn't be overheard. The sound of waves filled the silence as he explained the situation, Lee's cousin, the threats, the increased danger. Naomi listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. You're scared, she said finally. I can see it in your face. Jinwoo didn't deny it. I'm scared of what they might do to you to get to me. And I'm scared of what you might do to them because of me. Naomi turned to face him. Jinwoo, I don't want you starting a war over me. I'm not worth that. Don't. His voice was sharp. Don't tell me you're not worth it. You're worth everything. People will die. Maybe you. Maybe me. All because Lee Sangmin's cousin has something to prove. Then I'll make sure Jae-sung understands that proving it will cost him everything. Jinwoo took her hand. I know you don't want violence. I know this goes against everything you believe in. But this is my world, Naomi. This is how things work. And I will not let you be collateral damage in someone else's vendetta. Naomi was quiet again, her hand tight in his. I knew what I was getting into. I knew it would be dangerous. But knowing it intellectually and living it are different things. I know. And if you want out, if this is too much, I'll understand. I'll make sure you're protected, and then I'll remove myself from your life. Stop offering to leave. She said it forcefully, frustrated. I'm not going anywhere, Jinwoo. I'm scared and I'm angry that this is happening, but I'm not leaving. I just need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll be smart about this. Don't let anger or pride make you reckless. Don't throw your life away because someone threatened me. She squeezed his hand. You've spent 3 years barely living. I don't want to be the reason you stop living entirely. Jinwoo pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. I promise to be smart. But I also promise to do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Those 2 things might conflict sometimes. Then we figure it out together. No more making decisions alone. No more protecting me by keeping me in the dark. We're in this together or not at all. Together, Jinwoo agreed. They sat in the car for another hour, talking through scenarios and possibilities, making plans for what would happen in various situations. Naomi was clear-headed about it, practical in a way that reminded Jinwoo she'd been dealing with danger her whole life, just in different forms. By the time he drove her home, they'd established protocols, how she'd check in, what she'd do if she felt threatened, where she'd go if things escalated. At her door, Naomi turned back to him. I love you, you know. The words hit Jinwoo like a physical blow. They'd been dancing around this feeling for weeks, both aware of it, but neither saying it out loud. Hearing it now, in the middle of this crisis, felt both perfectly timed and impossibly reckless. I love you too, he said. That's why I'm so scared. I know. She kissed him softly. But love is worth being scared for. That's kind of the whole point. Jinwoo watched her go inside, waited until he saw her apartment lights come on, then called Dae-jung. Full perimeter tonight. No one gets near her building. Understood. He drove home feeling the weight of everything that could go wrong. Loving Naomi made him vulnerable in ways he'd never been before. It gave his enemies a weapon they could use against him. But it also gave him something to fight for beyond just power and territory. For the first time in his life, Jinwoo had something that mattered more than survival. The showdown with Park Jae-sung came 2 weeks later. Jae-sung had been carefully building his position, making alliances, gathering intelligence. Jinwoo had been doing the same, shoring up support among the families, making it clear that an attack on him would be an attack on the stability they all benefited from. It was a careful dance, politics mixed with threat, and both men knew that whoever moved first would need overwhelming force to succeed. The meeting was arranged on neutral ground, a warehouse owned by the Chinese organization that had stayed neutral in the Lee situation. Jinwoo arrived with Min Seo and 6 others, all armed, all prepared for this to go badly. Jae-sung had brought similar numbers. They faced each other across 20 feet of empty concrete, 2 men who'd never met but understood each other perfectly. Jae-sung was in his 30s, slim and sharp-featured, with eyes that calculated constantly. He looked at Jinwoo without fear or deference, just cold assessment. So you're the man who destroyed my cousin's life. I'm the man who gave your cousin a choice and let him live when I could have killed him. Jinwoo kept his voice level. If Lee told you a different story, he lied. He told me you went after him because of a woman. That you let personal feelings override business. That you're weak. Then he's a fool who doesn't understand the difference between weakness and having something to care about. Jae-sung smiled, sharp and humorless. You care about the black woman. The nurse. Naomi Williams. Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but every man in the room felt the temperature drop. Be very careful what you say next. I'm just stating facts. You dismantled Lee's operation because her brother was caught in it. You've been seeing her regularly. You've assigned unprecedented security to a civilian. Jae-sung took a step forward. You've made her a weakness everyone can exploit. Or I've made her a line no one should cross. The difference is in how you interpret it. I interpret it as an opportunity. I want my family's honor restored. I want Lee's territory and operations returned. And I want you to understand that you can't just destroy people's lives without consequences. Jae-sung's voice was cold. So here's my offer. You give me what I want, or I take what you care about. Jinwoo had known this was coming, had prepared for it. But hearing the threat spoken out loud still made his blood run cold. If you touch Naomi Williams, if you even think about touching her, I will burn everything you have to the ground. Your family, your allies, your operations. I will make you wish I'd killed you in this room. Empty threats from a man who's already shown his weakness. Not threats. Promises. Jinwoo's voice was absolutely certain. And here's another promise. You leave Los Angeles tonight. You go back to Korea and never return. You tell your family that Lee's exile stands, that his dishonor is his own, and that attempting to restore it will only bring more shame. Do that, and you live. Refuse, and you find out exactly how weak I am. Jae-sung studied him for a long moment. Jinwoo could see him weighing options, calculating odds, trying to determine if Jinwoo was bluffing. Finally, Jae-sung glanced at the men behind him, then back at Jinwoo. You'd really go to war over one woman? Without hesitation. That's insane. Maybe, but it's also non-negotiable. Jinwoo took a step forward. You came here thinking you could intimidate me, that threatening Naomi would make me fold. You were wrong. She doesn't make me weak. She makes me dangerous. Because now I have something I can't afford to lose, and that means I'll do things I wouldn't have done before. I'll take risks I wouldn't have taken. I'll be ruthless in ways that would have seemed excessive before. So ask yourself, do you really want to find out what I'm capable of when someone I love is threatened? The room was silent except for the distant sound of traffic. Jae-sung's men were tense, hands near weapons, waiting for orders. Jinwoo's people were equally ready, and everyone knew that if this went wrong, not everyone was walking out alive. Jae-sung broke first. You're serious. Deadly serious. Then you're a fool. Love makes you vulnerable. Maybe. But it also gives me something you don't have, a reason to win that goes beyond pride or money. Jinwoo's voice softened slightly. Go home, Jae-sung. There's no honor in dying over your cousin's mistakes. There's no glory in a war neither of us can truly win. Take the out I'm offering while you still can. For a long moment, Jae-sung said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll leave Los Angeles. But if I hear that you've shown weakness again, if I hear that you've let this woman make you soft, I'll come back. And next time, I won't be polite about it. If you come back, I'll kill you myself. No warnings, no meetings, no second chances. Jinwoo's voice was flat. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. Jae-sung took it. He and his men left the warehouse, and Jinwoo stood there in the silence that followed, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his system. Min Seo came to stand beside him. That could have gone worse. It could have gone better. You think he'll actually leave? For now. But he's right about one thing, love does make me vulnerable. It gives people a weapon to use against me. Jinwoo looked at his second-in-command. You think I'm making a mistake? Min Seo considered the question carefully. I think you're making a choice. Whether it's a mistake depends on whether you can live with the consequences. Can you? Jinwoo thought about Naomi, about the way she'd looked at him when she said she loved him, about the way his life had changed since she'd walked into it. Yes, I can live with the consequences. I couldn't live with the alternative. Then it's not a mistake. Jinwoo called Naomi from the car, told her it was over, that Jae-sung was leaving the city. He could hear the relief in her voice, the weight tension she'd been carrying for weeks finally released. Can I see you tonight? She asked. I'll be there in 30 minutes. When he arrived at her apartment, she was waiting at the door. She pulled him inside and wrapped her arms around him, holding tight, and Jinwoo let himself be held. For all his power and reputation, for all the fear he could inspire in men like Jae-sung, in this moment he was just a man grateful to have someone who cared whether he came home safe. I was scared, Naomi admitted. I tried not to be, tried to stay strong, but I was terrified something would happen to you. Nothing happened. It's over. For now. For now, Jinwoo agreed. But that's all we ever get, isn't it? Moments of peace between the chaos. The question is whether those moments are worth it. Naomi pulled back to look at him. Are they? Worth it, I mean. Jinwoo thought about the past 3 years, the emptiness and isolation, the feeling of being half alive. Then he thought about the past few months with Naomi, the way she'd brought color back into his gray world, the way she'd given him back not just his body, but his sense of being human. Yes, even with all the danger, all the complications, all the ways this could go wrong, yes, it's worth it. She kissed him then, deep and thorough, and Jinwoo responded with everything he had. They made love in her bed, urgent and intense, both of them needing the physical connection to prove they were alive and safe and together. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, talking quietly about nothing and everything, making plans for a future that neither of them was sure would materialize, but both were willing to fight for. What happens now? Naomi asked. Jae-sung leaves, but there will be others. There's always someone else. Then we deal with them as they come. Together. Jinwoo pulled her closer. I can't promise you safety, Naomi. I can't promise that being with me won't be dangerous sometimes. But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to protect you. And I can promise that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. The belief that I can be more than just the cold, broken thing I'd become. You made me human again. Naomi was quiet for a moment. You were always human, Jinwoo. You just forgot for a while. All I did was remind you. That's more than enough. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Jinwoo dreamed of a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine before. A future where he wasn't alone, where love was worth the risk, where being vulnerable didn't mean being weak. 3 months later, Jinwoo stood in his office looking out over Koreatown, thinking about everything that had changed. Jae-sung had kept his word and left Los Angeles. Other potential threats had backed off, understanding that targeting Naomi would cost more than it was worth. The organization was stable, profitable, and Jinwoo's position was more secure than it had been in years. But the real change was internal. Jinwoo felt different, lighter somehow, like a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. The shame and dysfunction that had haunted him for 3 years had faded, replaced by a confidence that went deeper than just physical capability. Naomi had given him that, had shown him that being broken didn't mean being worthless, that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. His phone buzzed. A text from Naomi. Dinner tonight? My place. I'll be there. He smiled, something that happened more often now. His subordinates had noticed the change, whispered about how their boss seemed different lately. Some thought it made him weak. But the smart ones, The ones who understood how the world really worked knew better. They knew that Jinwoo was more dangerous now than he'd ever been, because he had something to protect that mattered more than money or power or reputation. Minaseo appeared at his door. "We have the quarterly reports ready for review." "Good. Anything concerning?" "No. Actually, it's our best quarter in 2 years. Profits are up, conflicts are down, and the other families are respecting our boundaries. Then we're doing something right." Minaseo hesitated, then spoke. "The men are saying you've changed. That the woman has made you different. And what do you think?" "I think change isn't always bad. I think you seem happier than I've seen you in years. And I think anyone who mistakes happiness for weakness is making a fatal error." Minaseo smiled slightly. "She's good for you." "Yes, she is." After Minaseo left, Jinwoo returned to the window. Somewhere out there, Naomi was finishing her shift at the hospital, saving lives and being the kind of good person Jinwoo had never imagined he'd be lucky enough to love. She'd walked into his world asking questions about her brother's death, and she'd ended up giving Jinwoo back his life. For 3 years, his body had refused to work, had betrayed him in the most fundamental way, had made him feel less than a man. It had taken Naomi, with her strength and patience and refusal to see him as broken, to unlock what had been frozen inside him. She hadn't fixed him, healing was more complicated than that, but she'd given him the courage to try, to be vulnerable, to risk the possibility of failure for the chance at something real. And it had been worth it. Every dangerous moment, every threat, every complication that came with loving someone in his world, it had all been worth it for this feeling of being whole again, of being human again, of being more than just the cold enforcer he'd become. Jinwoo's phone buzzed again. Another text from Naomi. "Also, I'm making Korean food tonight. Fair warning, I'm not very good at it. I'll bring takeout as backup." Her response was an emoji, the laughing face he'd learned to associate with her particular brand of humor. Jinwoo looked at it for a moment, feeling something warm and unfamiliar in his chest. It took him a second to identify it. Joy. Pure, simple joy. For 3 years, he'd thought this feeling was gone forever, lost along with his ability to be intimate, buried under shame and isolation. But Naomi had proven him wrong. She'd shown him that even the deepest wounds could heal if you let someone help you carry them. She'd shown him that love wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but a strength worth fighting for. She'd shown him that being vulnerable with the right person didn't diminish you, it completed you. Jinwoo closed his laptop and gathered his things. He had dinner plans with a woman he loved, and for the first time in years, that felt more important than any business he could be conducting. He was still Jinwoo Park, still ran a criminal empire, still had blood on his hands that would never wash clean. But he was also a man capable of love, capable of healing, capable of being more than just the sum of his worst actions. And that, he thought as he left his office and headed toward Naomi's apartment, was worth everything. As he drove through the evening traffic, Jinwoo thought about the title someone might give his story if they knew it. Something dramatic probably, something about a powerful man brought low by injury and redeemed by love. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. He hadn't been redeemed. He was still the same man who'd ordered deaths, who'd built an empire on violence and fear, who'd made choices he could never undo. What had changed was his capacity to feel, to want, to hope. Naomi hadn't made him good. She'd just made him human again. And in his world, that was its own kind of miracle. His phone rang. Naomi's voice came through the speakers. "Hey, are you close? I may have slightly burned the rice. 10 minutes away. And I told you I'd bring backup. I wanted to try." She laughed. "Turns out Korean cooking is harder than it looks. I appreciate the effort." "Good. Because you're getting effort with a side of smoke alarm tonight." Jinwoo smiled as he navigated through traffic, listening to Naomi talk about her day, about the patients she'd seen, about the coworker who'd said something funny at lunch. It was so beautifully normal, so far removed from the world of threats and violence that usually defined his life. This was what she'd given him, not just the return of his physical capability, but these moments of ordinary happiness that he'd never known he was missing. When he arrived at her apartment, Naomi met him at the door with a sheepish expression and a slightly charred pot of rice. Jinwoo set down the takeout he'd brought and pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly, not caring about the burned rice or the smoke that still lingered in the air. "I love you," he said, because it was true and because he'd spent too many years not saying things that mattered. "I love you too." Naomi smiled against his lips. "Even though I'm a terrible cook. Especially because you tried." They ate the takeout Jinwoo had brought, sitting on Naomi's small couch, her legs draped over his lap, talking about nothing and everything. Later, they would make love in her bed, slow and tender, both of them grateful for what they had and aware of how fragile it was. And later still, Jinwoo would lie awake while Naomi slept, thinking about the future and the threats that would inevitably come, about how to protect this thing they'd built without destroying it in the process. But for now, in this moment, Jinwoo let himself just be. Not the boss, not the criminal, not the man haunted by 3 years of dysfunction and shame. Just a man in love, grateful for second chances and the woman brave enough to give him one. That was enough. That was everything. And as Naomi stirred in her sleep, curling closer to him, Jinwoo made himself a promise. Whatever came next, whatever threats or challenges or complications arose from loving someone in his world, he would face them. He would be smart and careful and ruthless when necessary. But he would not let fear or shame or the expectations of his world take this away from him. He'd spent 3 years barely living, and now that Naomi had shown him what being alive really meant, he wasn't going back to that empty existence. So yes, love made him vulnerable. Yes, it gave his enemies a potential weapon. Yes, it complicated everything about how he operated and who he could be. But it also made him whole in a way he'd never been before, and that was worth defending with everything he had. Jinwoo closed his eyes, his arms tight around Naomi, and let himself believe in the possibility of tomorrow. Not guaranteed, not safe, but possible. And in his world, possibility was everything. For 3 years, his manhood couldn't work. For 3 years, he'd felt broken and less than. For 3 years, he'd been half alive, going through the motions without feeling any of it. Then he'd met a stunning black woman who saw past his reputation to the human underneath, who challenged him to be better without asking him to be different, who gave him back his body and, more importantly, his hope. And that, Jinwoo thought as sleep finally claimed him, was the real story. Not about dysfunction and healing, though those were part of it, but about finding someone who makes you want to try again, who makes you believe that even the deepest wounds can heal, who shows you that being vulnerable isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. That was the gift Naomi had given him. And Jinwoo would spend the rest of his life being grateful for it.